The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 7B cast harsh shadows across the polished wood benches, creating an atmosphere as cold as the January morning outside. Helena Clearwater sat perfectly still in the second row, her simple navy dress a stark contrast to the expensive suits surrounding her. Her hands rested folded in her lap, wedding ring catching the light one final time before what everyone assumed would be her complete financial ruin. Across the aisle, her husband of 12 years made his grand entrance. Richard Clearwater strode through the courtroom doors like a man who owned the building itself, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with military precision. Behind him followed his legal army, 3 attorneys from Steinberg, Walsh & Associates, each carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Their leader, Marcus Steinberg himself, adjusted his silk tie and surveyed the courtroom with the confidence of a general reviewing his conquered territory. Richard's eyes found Helena, and he smiled, the same charming smile that had once made her heart race during their college days. Now it felt like ice water in her veins. He leaned over to whisper something to Steinberg, who glanced at Helena and chuckled softly. The sound carried across the courtroom, making several people turn to look at the woman everyone clearly expected to be destroyed today. The contrast could not have been more obvious. Richard's legal team occupied an entire table, documents spread out like battle plans, expensive technology gleaming under the courtroom lights. Helena sat with a single folder beside her, waiting for her court-appointed attorney who had yet to arrive. The whispers started immediately. "She's representing herself," one woman murmured to her companion. "How pathetic." Richard straightened his Armani jacket and turned to address his legal team loud enough for Helena to hear. "I almost feel sorry for her," he said with practiced concern. "She has no idea what she's up against. 12 years of marriage, and she still doesn't understand how the real world works." Steinberg nodded gravely, playing his part in the performance. "It's unfortunate when someone refuses to accept reality," he replied. "We've made extremely generous settlement offers, considering her contributions to the marriage." The courtroom doors opened again, and a harried-looking man in an ill-fitting suit hurried inside, clutching a worn briefcase that had seen better decades. Thomas Brennan looked exactly like what he was, an overworked public defender who had been assigned this case 3 days ago and was clearly struggling to keep up with the complexity of a high-asset divorce. His shoes squeaked against the floor as he approached Helena's table, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature. "Sorry I'm late," Brennan whispered as he sat down beside Helena. "Traffic was terrible, and I had to stop by the office to grab these files." He fumbled with his briefcase, papers scattering as he tried to organize his materials. Helena watched him with calm patience, her expression giving away nothing of what she was thinking. Richard's legal team exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Steinberg made a show of checking his Rolex, a gesture designed to emphasize the difference between their preparation and the chaos at Helena's table. One of his associates leaned forward and spoke just loud enough to be overheard. "Is this really the best representation the court could provide?" he asked with false sympathy. "It seems almost unfair to proceed under these circumstances." The comment drew more attention from the gallery, where Richard's business associates and country club friends had gathered to witness what they assumed would be Helena's public humiliation. She could feel their eyes on her, measuring her simple appearance against Richard's obvious wealth and success. Some of them had known her for years, had attended dinner parties at the mansion she had helped design, had benefited from her quiet intelligence and careful planning. Now they looked at her like a stranger, someone who had somehow fooled them all into thinking she belonged in their world. Brennan finally managed to get his papers sorted and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Clearwater," he began uncertainly, "I've reviewed the basic documentation, but I have to be honest with you. Your husband's legal team has compiled an impressive case. The property documentation alone spans several hundred pages, and they've clearly invested significant resources in this proceeding." Helena nodded once, her voice steady when she replied. "I understand the challenges we're facing, Mr. Brennan. Please proceed as you think best." Her calm response seemed to surprise Brennan, who had clearly expected tears or panic. He glanced at his notes again, then at the imposing legal team across the aisle. The disparity between the resources available to each side was so obvious that even the court reporter looked sympathetic. Richard stood and walked to the water fountain, making sure his path took him past Helena's table. As he passed, he paused and looked down at her with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so calculated. "Helena," he said softly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the nearby observers. "It's not too late to reconsider our settlement offer. This proceeding is going to be difficult for everyone involved, especially you. I don't want to see you embarrassed in front of all these people." She looked up at him for the first time that morning, her green eyes meeting his brown ones with a steadiness that made him blink first. "Thank you for your concern, Richard," she replied quietly. "I'm prepared for whatever comes next." Something in her tone made him pause, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features before his confident mask slipped back into place. He returned to his table, but Helena noticed he glanced back at her twice, as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't known existed. The courtroom continued to fill with observers, drawn by the promise of watching a wealthy man's wife get everything she deserved, which in their minds was very little. Helena could hear fragments of conversations, people discussing Richard's business acumen, his generous charitable donations, his leadership in the community. No one mentioned her role in any of it, the quiet work she had done behind the scenes, the connections she had facilitated, the problems she had solved without ever taking credit. Brennan leaned over to whisper urgently in her ear. "Mrs. Clearwater, I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this trial? Your husband's team has resources I simply cannot match. The discovery process alone has produced evidence that will be very difficult to counter." Helena smiled for the first time that morning, an expression so serene it seemed almost out of place in the tense atmosphere of the courtroom. "Mr. Brennan," she said quietly, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that look impossible to win." As she spoke, her eyes moved across the courtroom, taking in every face, every whispered conversation, every assumption being made about her capabilities and her future. Where others saw her watching and wondered about her thoughts, if they thought about it at all. Judge Patricia Hawthorne entered the courtroom with the measured dignity of someone who had presided over thousands of cases, her black robes flowing as she took her position behind the mahogany bench. The bailiff called the session to order, and the assembled crowd fell silent as the divorce proceedings of Clearwater versus Clearwater officially began. Steinberg rose first, his movements calculated and theatrical. He straightened his jacket and approached the bench with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case of this magnitude. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "today we will demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that my client, Mr. Richard Clearwater, has been the sole architect of the substantial marital estate currently under dispute." He gestured toward a wheeled cart laden with perfectly organized binders and folders. "The evidence before us spans 12 years of meticulous financial records, business transactions, and property acquisitions, all bearing the clear signature of Mr. Clearwater's entrepreneurial genius. His wife, while certainly a supportive presence in the household, contributed nothing of substance to the creation or maintenance of these assets." Helena sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap as Steinberg's words washed over the courtroom. Around her, she could hear the soft murmurs of agreement from Richard's supporters, their whispered comments painting her as nothing more than an expensive ornament who was now demanding compensation for simply existing in proximity to success. Brennan fumbled with his papers, clearly intimidated by the polished presentation unfolding before him. He leaned toward Helena and whispered urgently, "They've prepared an overwhelming case. Are you sure there isn't anything you haven't told me about your contributions to the marriage?" Helena's response was barely audible, but her voice carried absolute certainty. "Everything you need to know will become clear, Mr. Brennan. Please trust the process." Steinberg continued his opening statement with practiced precision. "The respondent, Mrs. Helena Clearwater, has lived a life of extraordinary privilege for the past 12 years. She has resided in a $7 million estate, driven luxury vehicles, traveled internationally, and enjoyed the finest amenities money can provide. All of this was made possible by the hard work and business acumen of my client, who built his empire from nothing." He paused dramatically, allowing his words to sink in before delivering what he clearly considered the killing blow. "The respondent now claims she deserves half of everything my client created, despite contributing nothing beyond her presence at social events and charitable functions. This is not a case about equal partnership, Your Honor. This is a case about someone who believes proximity to success entitles them to ownership of that success. The gallery erupted in soft applause until Judge Hawthorne gavelled for silence. Richard's business associates nodded their approval, clearly satisfied with this characterization of events. Helena could see Margaret Thornfield, the president of the country club board, whispering to the woman beside her about how some people simply didn't understand their place in society. Steinberg returned to his table with obvious satisfaction, leaving Brennan to rise on unsteady legs for his opening statement. The contrast was immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Where Steinberg had moved with theatrical confidence, Brennan shuffled his papers nervously and cleared his throat multiple times before speaking. Your Honor, he began hesitantly, my client Mrs. Clearwater has been a devoted wife for 12 years. She has supported her husband's career and contributed to their household in numerous ways that may not be immediately visible in financial records. One of Steinberg's associates leaned forward and whispered loud enough for nearby observers to hear. Is he really going to argue that doing laundry and hosting dinner parties entitles someone to millions of dollars? The comment drew chuckles from Richard's section of the courtroom, and Brennan's face flushed red with embarrassment. He glanced at Helena, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, her expression remaining mysteriously calm despite the obvious disaster unfolding around her. I find it interesting, Helena said quietly, speaking directly to Brennan but loud enough for others to hear, how quickly people assume they understand the full scope of someone's contributions without examining all the evidence. Her comment carried a strange weight that made several people turn to look at her more closely. For a moment, something flickered in Richard's eyes, a brief shadow of uncertainty that crossed his features before disappearing behind his confident mask. Steinberg stood again, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Your Honor, I apologize for interrupting my colleague's statement, but I feel compelled to address the respondent's comment. We have examined all the evidence extensively and thoroughly. Our investigation encompassed every aspect of the marital estate, every business transaction, every property acquisition. There are no hidden contributions because there simply weren't any contributions beyond those of a typical housewife. He walked to his evidence card and retrieved a thick binder, holding it up for the court to see. This documentation represents thousands of hours of forensic accounting, professional analysis, and legal research. Every asset, every investment, every business decision can be traced directly to my client's personal efforts and expertise. The weight of the binder seemed to emphasize his point, and several jurors nodded as if convinced by the sheer volume of documentation. Helena watched this performance with the same serene expression she had maintained all morning, as if she were observing events that had little to do with her personal future. Brennan attempted to regain control of his presentation, but his nervousness was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Mrs. Clearwater has been, he said, then stopped and shuffled his papers again. She has contributed to the marriage in ways that, while perhaps not directly financial, were nonetheless valuable to the overall success of the household. Another wave of barely suppressed laughter rippled through Richard's supporters. Helena could see Patricia Westbrook rolling her eyes dramatically while speaking behind her hand to the woman beside her about people who confused being decorative with being productive. You know what's fascinating about all of this, Helena said suddenly, her voice cutting through the courtroom chatter with unexpected clarity. She hadn't raised her volume, but something in her tone made everyone fall silent and turn toward her. Fascinating about what? Mrs. Clearwater, Judge Hawthorne asked, clearly intrigued by the change in the woman's demeanor. Helena stood slowly, her simple navy dress somehow managing to look more elegant than it had moments before. How certain everyone seems about things they've never actually investigated, she replied. 12 years is a long time, Your Honor. Long enough for many things to happen that might not be immediately obvious to casual observers. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and for the first time that morning, his confident expression wavered slightly. Steinberg frowned, clearly caught off guard by Helena's unexpected composure and cryptic comments. The courtroom had fallen completely silent now. everyone straining to understand what the quiet woman in the simple dress might be implying. Helena remained standing for a moment longer, her eyes moving slowly across the faces of everyone who had spent the morning dismissing her as irrelevant. As she sat back down, she placed her hand on the single folder beside her chair, and several people noticed that her fingers didn't tremble even slightly. For someone who was supposedly about to lose everything, Helena Clearwater looked remarkably like someone who was exactly where she wanted to be. "I wonder," she said softly to Brennan, but loud enough for others to hear, "how many people in this room have ever bothered to look at a property deed carefully? Really carefully, I mean. It's amazing what you can learn when you take the time to read the fine print." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and somewhere in the back of the courtroom, someone coughed nervously. Richard's legal team exchanged glances, suddenly unsure why the woman they had been systematically destroying seemed so strangely confident about what came next. Steinberg called Richard to the witness stand with the flourish of a conductor beginning a symphony. Richard rose from his chair with practiced grace, adjusting his platinum cufflinks as he walked toward the front of the courtroom. Every step radiated the confidence of a man who had built an empire and was now prepared to defend it against someone he considered woefully outmatched. "Your Honor," Richard began after taking his oath, his voice carrying the warm authority that had made him successful in countless business negotiations, "I built everything we have today from absolutely nothing. When Helena and I married 12 years ago, I was a junior analyst at a small investment firm, driving a used Honda and living in a studio apartment barely large enough for one person, let alone two." He turned slightly to address the gallery, his natural charisma filling the courtroom as he spoke. "I worked 18-hour days, spent weekends studying market trends, and invested every spare dollar into learning opportunities that would advance my career. Helena was certainly supportive during those early years, making sure I had clean clothes and hot meals when I came home exhausted from building our future." The emphasis he placed on the words clean clothes and hot meals made it clear exactly how he viewed his wife's contributions to their success. Several people in the gallery nodded approvingly, recognizing the familiar narrative of a self-made man whose wife had simply been along for the ride. Steinberg stepped forward with a document in his hand. "Mr. Clearwater, can you describe for the court how you acquired your first major investment property?" Richard's eyes lit up as he launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed story. "In our third year of marriage, I identified an undervalued commercial property in the downtown district. The previous owner was elderly and didn't understand the potential for development in that area. I spent months researching zoning laws, studying traffic patterns, and analyzing demographic trends before making my move." He paused dramatically, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom to ensure everyone was following his narrative. "I negotiated the purchase price down from $2.8 million to $1.9 million through careful analysis and strategic timing. Helena had no involvement in the research, negotiations, or financial arrangements. She didn't even visit the property until after the papers were signed." Helena sat quietly at her table, her expression unchanged as her husband painted a picture of their marriage that relegated her to the role of passive observer. Brennan scribbled notes frantically, clearly struggling to find angles for cross-examination that wouldn't make his client look worse. "The commercial property was just the beginning," Richard continued, his voice gaining momentum as he warmed to his favorite subject. "Over the next 5 years, I leveraged that initial investment to acquire 17 additional properties, including retail spaces, office buildings, and luxury residential developments." Steinberg produced a large poster board covered with photographs and financial charts. The visual presentation was impressive, showing a clear progression from modest beginnings to substantial wealth. Property values, rental income streams, and development profits were all meticulously documented and attributed entirely to Richard's expertise. "Each acquisition required months of careful planning," Richard explained, pointing to various charts and graphs. "I personally researched every investment opportunity, negotiated every contract, and managed every renovation project. Helena accompanied me to a few property viewings, but she had no input into any business decisions." The way he described these visits made it sound as if Helena had been little more than decorative accompaniment, someone who tagged along occasionally but contributed nothing of substance to the empire being built around her. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward with obvious interest. Mr. Clearwater, can you walk us through the acquisition of your current residence, the property at 15 Willow Creek Estate? Richard's smile broadened as he approached what was clearly the crown jewel of his presentation. Our home represents the culmination of everything I worked to achieve, Your Honor. $7 million, 12,000 square feet, situated on 4 acres of prime real estate in the most exclusive neighborhood in the county. He gestured expansively, as if the courtroom itself should be impressed by his success. I spent 2 years searching for the perfect property, analyzing market conditions, and waiting for the right opportunity. When this estate came on the market, I moved quickly to secure it before other buyers could interfere. Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of wealth being described. Helena remained perfectly still, but something in her posture suggested she was listening more intently than her calm expression indicated. The purchase required complex financing arrangements, Richard continued, his voice taking on the technical precision of someone who enjoyed demonstrating his expertise. I structured a combination of traditional mortgage financing, commercial loans against my property portfolio, and private investor partnerships to secure the necessary capital. Steinberg nodded approvingly as his client detailed the intricate financial maneuvering that had made the purchase possible. Every aspect of the transaction showcased Richard's business acumen and left no room for anyone to claim his wife had contributed anything meaningful to the acquisition. Helena's role during this entire process, Richard said, his tone becoming almost patronizing, was to choose paint colors and furniture arrangements. Important decisions for creating a comfortable home environment, certainly, but hardly the kind of contributions that would justify ownership claims against assets I worked years to acquire. The gallery buzzed with approving murmurs as Richard's supporters clearly felt he was making an excellent case for retaining full control of his wealth. Margaret Thornfield whispered to her companions about how refreshing it was to see someone willing to speak honestly about marriage roles and expectations. Your Honor, Richard continued, his confidence now at its absolute peak, I want to be completely transparent about our marital dynamics. Helena has lived a comfortable life because of my success, but comfort and contribution are 2 entirely different things. He turned to look directly at his wife for the first time during his testimony, his expression mixing pity with condescension. She has never held a job during our marriage, never generated income, never participated in business planning, and never invested her own resources in any of our acquisitions. She has been, quite simply, the beneficiary of my hard work rather than a partner in creating our wealth. The words hung in the courtroom like a verdict already rendered, and several of Richard's business associates exchanged satisfied glances. This was exactly the kind of clear-eyed assessment they expected from a successful man who refused to be taken advantage of by someone who had contributed nothing to his empire. Steinberg returned to his table with obvious satisfaction, clearly pleased with how effectively his client had demolished any possible claims Helena might make to their marital assets. The documentary evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was compelling, and the contrast between Richard's obvious competence and Helena's apparent passivity could not have been more stark. As Richard prepared to step down from the witness stand, he glanced once more at Helena, expecting to see defeat or at least concern in her expression. Instead, he found her watching him with the same mysterious calm she had maintained all morning, her green eyes holding something he couldn't quite identify. For just a moment, his absolute confidence wavered slightly. There was something in her gaze that suggested she knew something he didn't, something that made his perfectly constructed narrative feel suddenly incomplete. But the moment passed quickly, and Richard dismissed the feeling as nothing more than his wife's attempt to maintain dignity in the face of inevitable defeat. After all, what could someone who had spent 12 years choosing paint colors possibly know that his team of expert attorneys and forensic accountants had missed? Judge Hawthorne turned toward the defense table with measured patience. Mr. Brennan, you may now present your case for Mrs. Clearwater. Brennan rose slowly, his earlier nervousness somehow transformed into something that resembled quiet determination. He walked toward his briefcase with deliberate steps that seemed oddly confident given his previous fumbling performance. The change was subtle but noticeable enough to make several people in the gallery lean forward with renewed attention. Your Honor, Brennan began, his voice now steady and clear. I believe the testimony we've just heard presents an incomplete picture of the marital partnership between Mr. and Mrs. Clearwater. While my colleague has provided extensive documentation of property acquisitions and business transactions, there are certain foundational elements that require clarification. Steinberg frowned slightly, clearly surprised by the transformation in his opponent's demeanor. The nervous public defender who had fumbled with papers that morning seemed to have been replaced by someone who spoke with quiet authority about foundational elements and incomplete pictures. Brennan reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope that appeared to be sealed with red wax. The formal appearance of the document immediately drew attention from everyone in the courtroom, including Richard, who leaned forward in the witness stand to get a better look at paperwork he had never seen before. Mr. Brennan, Judge Hawthorne said with obvious curiosity, "What documentation are you presenting to the court?" "Your Honor," Brennan replied, producing a letter opener from his jacket pocket with practiced efficiency, "I am presenting property records that predate Mr. Clearwater's testimony by several years. Documents that establish certain ownership claims that appear to have been overlooked during the extensive research conducted by opposing counsel." The red wax seal broke with an audible crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent courtroom. Brennan extracted several pages of legal documents, each bearing official seals and notarized signatures that suggested they had been prepared by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. Helena spoke for the first time since the proceedings had begun, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom with an authority that made everyone turn toward her. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "I believe the court would benefit from understanding the timeline of these particular property records." The transformation in her voice was remarkable. Gone was any trace of the quiet, defeated woman who had sat passively while her husband described her as little more than an expensive decoration. Helena Clearwater now spoke with the measured precision of someone who had been carefully observing every detail of the morning's proceedings while waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal her hand. Richard's confident expression began to crack as he watched his wife display a level of composure and legal knowledge that seemed completely at odds with the helpless housewife narrative he had been constructing. His eyes moved frantically between Helena and the mysterious documents Brennan was now examining with obvious familiarity. Steinberg stood abruptly, his polished demeanor showing the first signs of genuine concern. "Your Honor, I must object to the introduction of documents that were not disclosed during discovery. My client has been completely transparent about all marital assets, and any legitimate documentation should have been made available for our review weeks ago." Helena's response came before Judge Hawthorne could rule on the objection, and her words carried a weight that made the entire courtroom fall silent. "Mr. Steinberg," she said with calm precision, "I believe you'll find that your extensive research may have focused on the wrong time period entirely. These documents predate your client's involvement in the properties he's claimed as his own creations." The implications of her statement hit Richard like a physical blow. His face went pale as he began to understand that his wife was suggesting something that would undermine every word of his carefully constructed testimony. The $7 million estate, the commercial properties, the entire financial empire he had described building from nothing might not belong to him at all. Brennan moved toward the witness stand with documents in hand, his earlier bumbling completely forgotten as he assumed the role of an attorney who had been playing a very different game than anyone realized. "Mr. Clearwater," he said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had been waiting all morning for this moment, "I'd like you to examine these property records and tell the court if you recognize the names listed as the original purchasers." Richard's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the documents, his eyes scanning the pages with growing horror. The papers were official property deeds, each bearing seals and signatures that established legal ownership dates that preceded his own involvement by months or even years. The name that appeared repeatedly throughout the documentation was not Richard Clearwater, despite his claims of having personally negotiated every acquisition and structured every complex financial arrangement. The name that appeared as the legal purchaser, the one whose signature authorized every transaction and whose resources had funded every acquisition, was someone else entirely. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward with obvious interest as she watched Richard's confident facade crumble in real time. "Mr. Clearwater," she said, Can you read aloud the name that appears as the purchaser on the first property deed? Richard's voice came out as barely a whisper, his earlier commanding presence completely evaporated. The deed lists the purchaser as Helena M. Clearwater, he said, then stopped as if the words themselves were impossible to comprehend. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. Helena had not been the passive beneficiary of her husband's success. She had been the actual source of the wealth he had claimed as his own creation. Brennan continued his methodical destruction of Richard's narrative, producing document after document that established Helena as the legal owner of properties her husband had described building from nothing through his own expertise and hard work. Each deed, each contract, each financial arrangement bore her name and her signature, creating an undeniable paper trail that stretched back years. "Your Honor," Brennan said, his transformation now complete as he assumed the role of lead counsel in a case that had just become infinitely more complex. "I believe the court can see that my client's contributions to this marriage extend far beyond choosing paint colors and arranging furniture." Helena remained seated at the defense table, but her posture had changed completely. Where she had appeared small and defeated hours earlier, she now sat with the quiet dignity of someone who had allowed others to underestimate her while she waited for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. The expensive legal team that had spent the morning systematically humiliating her now scrambled to understand how their extensive research had missed documentation that completely reversed everything they thought they knew about the case. Steinberg huddled with his associates, their confident whispers replaced by urgent, confused conversations about how such fundamental information could have escaped their notice. Richard remained frozen in the witness stand, staring at documents that bore his wife's name and wondering how the woman he had dismissed as legally and financially irrelevant had managed to own everything he thought belonged to him. For 12 years, he had believed himself to be the architect of their wealth, never questioning where the initial capital had come from or whose name actually appeared on the foundational paperwork. Judge Hawthorne studied the documents with growing amazement, clearly recognizing that she was witnessing one of the most dramatic reversals in her years on the bench. The quiet woman in the simple navy dress had just revealed herself to be something entirely different from what everyone had assumed. Helena finally stood, her movement commanding immediate attention from every person in the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had been waiting 12 years for this moment. "I believe it's time for the court to understand exactly who has been supporting whom in this marriage." Judge Hawthorne held the property deed closer to the light, her experienced eyes scanning every detail of the document with growing amazement. The paper before her was not some hastily prepared forgery or recent alteration, but an official record that had been filed with the county registrar years before Richard Clearwater had ever claimed ownership of the property in question. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood she was witnessing legal history in the making, "please read aloud the full legal name that appears as the purchaser on the deed for 15 Willow Creek Estate." Brennan approached the bench with steady confidence, his earlier transformation now complete as he assumed his role as the architect of Richard's destruction. The deed clearly states, "Your Honor," that the property was purchased on March 15, 2013, by Helena Margaret Whitmore Clearwater, utilizing funds from the Whitmore Family Trust, established 1987. The name hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Whitmore, not the anonymous housewife everyone had assumed Helena to be, but a Whitmore, member of one of the oldest and wealthiest families in the region. The Whitmore name appeared on hospital wings, university buildings, and charitable foundations throughout the state. Richard's face went from pale to ashen as the implications crashed over him like a tidal wave. Helena Margaret Whitmore, the quiet woman he had patronized for 12 years, the wife he had dismissed as contributing nothing beyond decorative presence, was actually the heir to a fortune that dwarfed anything he had ever imagined building through his own efforts. "Your Honor," Helena said, rising from her chair with newfound authority, "I believe it's time to clarify exactly how my husband acquired the capital for his so-called self-made empire." She walked toward the witness stand where Richard sat frozen, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The commercial property Mr. Clearwater described as his first major acquisition was purchased using a loan secured against assets from my family trust. The initial down payment of $600,000 came directly from an account I established specifically to support my husband's business ventures. She paused, allowing the full weight of this revelation to sink in before continuing. The forensic accounting conducted by Mr. Steinberg's team apparently failed to trace the actual source of the capital that funded every single property acquisition my husband has claimed as evidence of his business genius. Steinberg scrambled to his feet, his polished demeanor completely shattered. Your Honor, this is impossible. Our research was exhaustive. We traced every financial transaction, every loan application, every business arrangement spanning the entire 12-year period of the marriage. Helena turned toward him with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Mr. Steinberg, she said with devastating calm, your research focused exclusively on accounts and transactions bearing the Clearwater name. You never thought to investigate the Whitmore family holdings because you assumed, like everyone else in this room, that I was simply a housewife who brought nothing to the marriage. She walked to Brennan's table and retrieved a thick folder that had been sitting unopened throughout the morning's proceedings. The folder contained not the scattered papers of an overmatched public defender, but the meticulously organized documentation of someone who had been planning this moment for years. Your Honor, she continued, every property my husband described acquiring through his expertise and hard work was purchased using capital I provided through various trust arrangements established before our marriage. The complicated financing structures he detailed were necessary precisely because he was borrowing against assets that belonged to my family, not building wealth from his own resources. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. Helena, that's not how it happened. I built this empire through my own work, my own knowledge, my own investments. She turned toward him with an expression of such profound disappointment that several people in the gallery actually winced. Richard, she said softly, you built nothing. You managed properties I purchased, using capital I provided, through arrangements I negotiated with my family's financial advisors. For 12 years, I allowed you to believe you were the architect of our wealth because I thought it would make you happy. The courtroom had fallen into absolute silence as the scope of Richard's deception, both of others and himself, became clear. The successful businessman who had testified about his expertise and accomplishments was actually someone who had been living off his wife's family fortune while convincing himself and everyone else that he was a self-made success. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward, clearly fascinated by the unfolding revelation. Mrs. Clearwater, can you explain why you chose to conceal your family's involvement in these financial arrangements? Helena's response carried the weight of years of careful observation and growing disappointment. Your Honor, I came from a family where wealth was considered a responsibility, not an entitlement. I was raised to use resources wisely and to support people I cared about in achieving their goals. When I married Richard, I genuinely believed in his potential and wanted to help him succeed. She gestured toward the documentation spread across the tables. I structured every financial arrangement to appear as though the capital came from Richard's business activities because I thought it would preserve his dignity and self-confidence. I never imagined he would convince himself that my family's money was actually the result of his own genius. The revelation continued to unfold as Brennan produced document after document establishing Helena's true financial position. Bank statements showing trust fund disbursements that coincided exactly with Richard's claimed property acquisitions. Legal agreements transferring Whitmore family assets into accounts accessible to Richard's business ventures. Financial records proving that every dollar of their marital wealth had originated from sources that predated their marriage by decades. Richard sat in stunned silence as his entire self-image crumbled around him. The confident entrepreneur who had built an empire from nothing was actually a man who had spent 12 years managing his wife's money, while she quietly enabled his fantasy of being a self-made success. Your Honor, Helena said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had been holding back the truth for far too long. I want the court to understand that I never intended for this information to become public. I hoped my marriage could survive my husband's need to believe he was something he wasn't. She looked directly at Richard, her expression mixing sadness with steely resolve. but I cannot allow him to claim ownership of assets that belong to my family, especially when he's attempting to use those same assets to humiliate me in front of people who should have known better. The reference to the morning's systematic mockery sent a ripple of uncomfortable awareness through the gallery. Everyone who had spent hours watching Helena's apparent defeat now realized they had been witnessing something entirely different. They had been watching a wealthy woman allow herself to be humiliated by a man who owed everything to her generosity. Steinberg made one last desperate attempt to salvage his case. Your Honor, even if these documents establish Mrs. Clearwater's family as the source of initial capital, Mr. Clearwater's management and expertise clearly increased the value of these assets substantially over the past 12 years. Helena's response was swift and devastating. Mr. Steinberg, she said, the properties have been professionally managed by Whitmore Family Holdings throughout our entire marriage. Richard's involvement was largely ceremonial, though I allowed him to believe otherwise because I thought it made him feel useful and important. She produced a final set of documents that established the existence of a professional property management company that had been handling every aspect of the real estate portfolio Richard claimed to have personally developed and maintained. The revelation was complete. Richard Clearwater, the confident businessman who had spent the morning describing his empire-building genius, was actually a man who had been living in a carefully constructed fantasy enabled by his wife's wealth and managed by professionals he had never known existed. As the full scope of the truth settled over the courtroom, Richard's supporters began to understand that they had not been witnessing the destruction of a gold-digging wife. They had been watching a wealthy woman finally decide to stop enabling her husband's delusions of adequacy. Judge Hawthorne looked at the man in the witness stand with something approaching pity. Mr. Clearwater, she said quietly, do you have anything to say in response to these revelations? Richard's voice, when it finally came, was barely audible and completely stripped of the confidence that had carried him through years of believing his own fiction. I never knew, he whispered, staring at his hands. I never knew any of this. Judge Hawthorne removed her reading glasses and surveyed the courtroom with the measured deliberation of someone who had witnessed one of the most extraordinary reversals in her judicial career. The silence that had settled over the assembled observers was thick with the weight of revelations that had fundamentally altered everyone's understanding of the case before them. Mr. Clearwater, she said, her voice carrying both authority and unmistakable disappointment, please step down from the witness stand. Based on the evidence presented today, this court finds that the respondent, Mrs. Helena Clearwater, is the rightful owner of all marital assets acquired during the course of this marriage. The formal pronouncement hit Richard like a physical blow. He remained frozen in the witness chair for several seconds, his mind apparently unable to process the reality that everything he had believed about his life for the past 12 years had been systematically dismantled in the span of a single morning. Furthermore, Judge Hawthorne continued, this court finds that the petitioner engaged in a pattern of deception regarding the source and nature of marital assets. Mr. Clearwater's claims of having created wealth through his own business acumen are not supported by evidence and appear to have been maintained through willful ignorance of his wife's financial contributions. Helena stood as the judge spoke, her transformation from defeated housewife to powerful heiress now complete in the eyes of everyone present. The simple navy dress that had seemed shabby compared to Richard's expensive suit now appeared elegantly understated, the choice of someone confident enough in their position to avoid ostentatious displays of wealth. Steinberg made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his case. Your Honor, my client was clearly unaware of the complex financial arrangements underlying these property acquisitions. Surely the court can recognize that he acted in good faith based on his understanding of the situation. Helena's response was swift and merciless. Mr. Steinberg, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 12 years watching and learning. Good faith would have involved asking questions about where the money came from instead of simply assuming it materialized through superior masculine business acumen. The rebuke sent a ripple of uncomfortable recognition through the gallery. Every person who had spent the morning nodding along with Richard's narrative of self-made success now realized they had participated in a collective fantasy that said more about their own assumptions than about reality. Your Honor, Helena continued, Addressing Judge Hawthorne directly, I want the court to understand that my family's resources were always available to support this marriage. I chose to structure the financial arrangements discreetly because I believe my husband's self-confidence was more important than ensuring he understood the true source of our wealth. She paused, her eyes moving across the faces of Richard's supporters who had spent hours watching her systematic humiliation with obvious satisfaction. I was wrong, she said simply. Allowing someone to build their identity on a foundation of lies serves no one, least of all the person living those lies. Judge Hawthorne nodded approvingly as she prepared to formalize her ruling. This court hereby awards all marital property to Mrs. Helena Clearwater, including but not limited to the residence at 15 Willow Creek Estate, all commercial real estate holdings, and all associated rental income streams. Mr. Clearwater's claims to these assets are denied in their entirety. Richard finally found the strength to stand, his legs unsteady as the full implications of the ruling settled over him. The mansion he had considered proof of his success belonged entirely to the wife he had spent the morning dismissing as irrelevant. The commercial properties that had funded their lifestyle for years were assets he had never actually owned. The empire he thought he had built was actually a trust fund he had been allowed to manage. The judge continued with relentless precision. Furthermore, Mr. Clearwater will vacate the marital residence within 30 days and will have no claim to any assets acquired during the marriage. Given the deceptive nature of his testimony regarding asset ownership, this court sees no basis for awarding alimony or support payments of any kind. Helena remained standing as the verdict was delivered, her posture reflecting the quiet dignity of someone who had endured systematic humiliation before revealing that she had held all the power from the beginning. The contrast between her mourning demeanor and her current authority was so stark that several observers found themselves questioning how they had ever believed Richard's version of events. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations as Richard's supporters began to grasp the magnitude of their error in judgment. Margaret Thornfield, who had spent hours making snide comments about people knowing their place in society, now found herself staring at a woman whose family had been prominent in the region for generations, while her own membership in the country club depended entirely on her husband's business relationship with the Clearwater properties. Brennan gathered his documents with obvious satisfaction, his transformation from bumbling public defender to strategic legal mastermind now revealed as a carefully orchestrated performance. Helena had chosen her representation wisely, selecting someone whose unimpressive appearance would encourage her opponents to underestimate their preparation and strategy. As the proceedings drew to a close, Helena addressed the courtroom one final time, her voice carrying across the space with unmistakable authority. "Your Honor," she said, "I hope today's revelations serve as a reminder that assumptions about people's capabilities and contributions are often based more on prejudice than reality." The comment was directed at everyone who had participated in her mourning humiliation, from Richard's expensive legal team to the gallery of supporters who had watched her apparent destruction with obvious pleasure. Each person now faced the uncomfortable realization that they had revealed more about their own biases than about Helena's actual position or worth. Richard began the slow walk toward the exit, his earlier confident stride replaced by the uncertain steps of someone whose entire identity had been revealed as a carefully maintained fiction. The expensive suit that had seemed to symbolize his success now looked like a costume he had no right to wear. As he reached the courtroom doors, Helena called his name one last time. "Richard," she said, her voice mixing sadness with finality, "you could have simply asked where the money came from. I would have told you the truth if you had ever been interested in hearing it." The observation carried the weight of 12 years of missed opportunities for honest conversation, 12 years of a marriage built on assumptions rather than understanding. Richard paused at the doors but did not turn around, apparently lacking the courage to face the woman whose generosity he had mistaken for dependence. The courtroom began to empty as observers filed out in subdued conversations, their earlier entertainment replaced by uncomfortable self-reflection about the morning's events. People who had arrived expecting to watch a wealthy man defend his success against an undeserving wife now found themselves reconsidering everything they thought they understood about marriage, wealth, and worth. Judge Hawthorne remained at her bench for several minutes after the formal proceedings concluded, clearly processing the extraordinary nature of what had transpired. The quiet woman who had appeared destined for financial ruin had instead delivered one of the most complete reversals of fortune the court had ever witnessed. Helena gathered her single folder and walked toward the exit with measured steps, her dignity intact despite the morning's orchestrated humiliation. As she reached the doors, she paused and looked back at the empty courtroom where her 12-year marriage had finally ended. "For those of you watching this unfold," she said, addressing an audience beyond the courtroom walls, "remember that quiet people often see and understand more than others realize. Sometimes the most powerful response to arrogance is simply revealing the truth." The morning had begun with Richard's confident assertion that he had built everything from nothing, while his wife contributed only her presence. It ended with the revelation that Helena had built everything while allowing her husband to believe he was something he had never actually been. Justice, as it turned out, sometimes wore a simple navy dress and waited 12 years for the perfect moment to speak.